The first sign that something was seriously messed up came around 3 in the afternoon when Marcus Thompson heard the screaming from his apartment window. Not the usual kind of yelling you'd hear in downtown Detroit. This was different, raw and terrified, the kind that made your blood run cold. Marcus had been a firefighter for 12 years, so he'd heard plenty of people in distress, but this was something else entirely. He moved to the window of his third-floor walk-up and pulled back the curtain, squinting against the autumn sunlight. What he saw made absolutely no sense at all. Down on Jefferson Avenue, people were running in every direction like someone had kicked over an anthill. But they weren't just running from something, some of them were chasing others, and the way they moved was all wrong, jerky and aggressive, like their bodies had forgotten how to work properly. Marcus grabbed his phone and tried calling his station, but the line was busy. He tried again. Still busy. That never happened. He pulled up the news on his phone and froze. Every major network was showing the same chaotic scenes. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Atlanta, cities across the country were experiencing what the reporters were cautiously calling violent disturbances and mass hysteria events. Nobody was saying the Z word yet, but Marcus had watched enough late-night horror flicks to know what he was looking at. The footage showed people attacking others with their teeth, their hands, showing no sign of pain when security or police tried to stop them. The newscast cut out suddenly, replaced by an emergency broadcast signal. The automated voice instructed everyone to stay indoors, lock their doors and windows, and await further instructions. Marcus felt his stomach drop. This was really happening. Across town in the suburb of Bloomfield Hills, Jennifer Hayes was picking up her daughter from elementary school when her phone started blowing up with notifications. Jennifer was a nurse at Henry Ford Hospital, and the messages flooding in from her coworkers were increasingly frantic. "Don't come in," one text read. "The ER is overrun." Another said, "They're biting people. The bite victims are turning violent." Jennifer's hands tightened on the steering wheel as her 9-year-old daughter, Emma, chattered away in the back seat about her day, completely oblivious to the panic building in her mother's chest. Jennifer had seen a lot in her 15 years in emergency medicine, but nothing in her training had prepared her for what her colleagues were describing. She made a split-second decision and drove past their house, heading instead for her brother's place out in the countryside. If things were as bad as they sounded, the city was the last place they needed to be. Downtown, in the financial district, Tyler Rodriguez was in the middle of a presentation to his firm's biggest clients when someone burst into the conference room. It was Sheila from reception, and her professional composure was completely gone. Her mascara was running down her face, and there was blood on her blouse. "We need to leave right now," she gasped. "They're in the building. They're attacking people in the lobby." Tyler's boss, a guy named Preston who never showed emotion about anything, actually went pale. Everyone rushed to the windows. 15 floors below, the streets were absolute chaos. Cars had crashed into each other and lampposts. Smoke was rising from several locations. And everywhere, people were attacking each other with a viciousness that didn't seem human. Tyler watched in horror as a mailman tackled a woman to the ground. Even from this distance, he could see the unnatural way the attacker moved, could see that something fundamental was wrong. The conference room erupted into panic. Some people were calling loved ones, others were arguing about whether to stay put or try to evacuate. Tyler's military training kicked in. He'd done 4 years in the Marines before going to business school. "Everyone shut up for a second," he said, his voice cutting through the noise with command authority. People actually listened. "We're not going anywhere right now. Look at those streets, we'd be sitting ducks. We stay here, we secure this floor, and we figure out what we're dealing with." Preston started to object, but the sound of screaming from somewhere below them in the building made him reconsider. Tyler took charge, organizing people to barricade the stairwell doors and gather anything that could be used as a weapon. He had no idea if it would be enough, but doing something was better than standing around losing their minds. Back at Marcus's apartment, the firefighter was doing his own rapid assessment. He lived alone since his divorce, which right now felt like both a blessing and a curse. He wouldn't have to worry about protecting anyone else, but he also didn't have backup. His training had taught him to stay calm in emergencies, to think systematically. First priority, security. He went through his apartment, checking that all windows were locked, then pushed his heavy couch in front of the main door. It wouldn't stop a determined assault, but it would slow someone down. Second priority, supplies. He took inventory, half a case of bottled water, some canned goods, cereal, not much else. His bug-out bag was in the closet, a habit from his time in the National Guard. It had a first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, water purification tablets, and some energy bars. Third priority, information. He needed to understand what was happening. Marcus turned on his TV, flipping through channels. Most were showing the emergency broadcast signal now, but a few local stations were still on the air, their anchors looking increasingly terrified as they read reports coming in. The situation was deteriorating fast. Hospitals were being overwhelmed. Police and emergency services were stretched impossibly thin. There were reports of people dying from bites and injuries, then getting back up and attacking others. One brave reporter, a young woman stationed outside Detroit Receiving Hospital, was describing the scene when something, lurched into frame behind her. The cameraman shouted a warning, and the feed cut to black. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The authorities had lost control. This wasn't going to be contained. Jennifer and Emma made it to her brother's farm just as the sun was starting to get low in the sky. Jake Peterson had been a prepper for years, something the family had always gently mocked him for. Not anymore. When Jennifer came flying up the long driveway and jumped out of her car, Jake took one look at her face and said, "It's happening, isn't it? What I've been saying." Jennifer just nodded. Jake didn't waste time on "I told you so's." He hustled them inside, where his wife Rachel was already monitoring multiple news feeds on laptops set up on the kitchen table. Their own two kids, teenagers named Connor and Lily, were helping their dad carry supplies in from the barn. Jake had converted his property into a small fortress over the years, reinforced doors, a well for water, solar panels for backup power, and enough food stored to last months. Jennifer had always thought it was excessive. Now it might save their lives. As darkness fell, the true horror of the situation became apparent. The emergency broadcasts were becoming less frequent, replaced by dead air on many channels. The few reports that did come through painted a picture of complete societal collapse happening in real time. The infection, because that's what they were calling it now, spread through bites, and the incubation period seemed to be anywhere from a few minutes to a few hours. The infected lost all higher brain function, becoming aggressive and single-mindedly focused on attacking the uninfected. They didn't feel pain, didn't tire, and didn't stop unless their brain was destroyed. The word zombie was finally being used, though it felt absurd to say it out loud. This was supposed to be the stuff of movies and video games, not real life in America. Tyler and his group of survivors in the office building had their first real encounter with the infected around 8 p.m. They'd been hearing sounds from other floors for hours, crashes, screams, running footsteps, but had managed to stay isolated on the 15th floor. Then someone tried to break through one of their barricaded doors. The pounding was relentless, accompanied by a horrible moaning sound that raised every hair on Tyler's neck. Through the small window in the door, he could see one of the building's security guards, a guy named Dennis who Tyler had chatted with 100 times. Except it wasn't really Dennis anymore. His eyes were clouded over, milky white. His jaw worked constantly, teeth gnashing. Dark blood covered the front of his uniform. He slammed against the door over and over, not reacting at all when the impacts must have been breaking bones in his hands and shoulders. The people in the conference room watched in silent horror. A woman named Ashley started crying quietly. Another colleague, James, looked like he might throw up. "Is there any way he's still in there?" someone asked. "Can they recover from this?" Tyler shook his head slowly. "Look at him, man. There's nobody home. Whatever that infection does, it kills who they were." The pounding continued for another 20 minutes before Dennis finally wandered off, drawn by some sound or movement elsewhere. Everyone let out a collective breath, but Tyler knew it was only a matter of time before more of them showed up. They needed a plan that went beyond just hiding and hoping for rescue. Marcus had come to the same conclusion in his apartment. He'd been monitoring the situation, and it was clear the government wasn't going to swoop in and fix this. The National Guard was being mobilized, but there were reports of units being overrun. The infection was spreading too fast. He needed to get out of the city, head somewhere less populated where he'd have a better chance. But going out there in the dark was suicide. He'd wait until first light, then make his move. In the meantime, he went through his apartment gathering anything useful: knives from the kitchen, duct tape, rope, warm clothes. He filled his bathtub with water before the supply was cut off or contaminated. He charged every device he owned. Then he sat by the window with a baseball bat across his lap, watching the fires burning across the city, listening to the distant screams and sirens, and tried to come up with a plan. The night was hell for everyone trying to survive. Jennifer and her family were relatively safe at Jake's farm, but the fear was overwhelming. They took turns keeping watch, looking out at the access road for any signs of the infected. Jake's property was isolated, which was good, but they could see the glow of fires from the direction of the nearest town. The radio was their only connection to the outside world now, and the news was uniformly bad. Reports were coming in of major cities being completely lost to the infection. The president had addressed the nation briefly, urging calm and promising that everything possible was being done, but even his usually confident voice had sounded shaken. Then the official broadcasts stopped entirely, replaced by automated emergency messages telling people to shelter in place. Emma and the other kids eventually fell asleep despite their fear, but the adults stayed up, talking in low voices about what came next. "This is it, isn't it?" Rachel said quietly. "The world we knew is gone." Jake nodded grimly. "We've got maybe a week or two before people start running out of supplies in the cities. Then we'll see refugees coming through, and not all of them will be friendly. We need to be ready to defend this place." Jennifer's medical training was already working on the problem. "We need to understand the infection better. The reports said it spreads through bites, but what about other bodily fluids? How long can the infected survive without food? Do they eventually decay? There's so much we don't know." They talked through scenarios and strategies until exhaustion finally pulled them toward brief, uneasy sleep. Tyler's group made it through the night without another direct encounter, but they could hear the infected moving through the building, could hear them attacking any other survivors they found. By morning, the sounds had decreased, either there were fewer infected in the building, or fewer living people for them to hunt. Tyler stood at the window watching the sunrise over a transformed Detroit. Smoke hung over the city like a shroud. Fires burned unchecked. The streets were littered with abandoned cars and bodies. And moving through it all were the infected, hundreds or maybe thousands of them, wandering aimlessly until something drew their attention. The normal morning sounds of the city, traffic, construction, the general hum of urban life, were gone, replaced by an eerie quiet broken only by occasional screams and crashes. "We can't stay here," Tyler announced to the group. There were 12 of them total, 7 men, 5 women, ranging from early 20s to late 50s. They were accountants, lawyers, administrative staff, not exactly a crack team of survival experts. But they were smart and motivated to stay alive, which would have to be enough. "We don't have enough food or water to last more than a few days, and I don't think help is coming. We need to get out of the city, find somewhere defensible, and figure out how to survive long-term. There were objections, of course. Preston, still clinging to his authority despite the situation, argued they should stay put and wait for the authorities to restore order. But most of the group could see that wasn't going to happen. They spent the morning planning their escape. Tyler organized them into teams based on their abilities and physical condition. Sheila, despite her panic the day before, turned out to be surprisingly tough and good at keeping people calm. James, a former college athlete, was strong and quick. Ashley worked through her fear and volunteered to help navigate. She'd grown up in the city and knew the streets well. They gathered anything that could serve as a weapon: letter openers, scissors, fire extinguishers, chair legs broken off and sharpened. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Their plan was to make their way down the emergency stairs to the parking garage, then try to get to Tyler's truck. If they could reach the vehicle, they'd drive north, away from the city, and hope to find somewhere safe. Marcus had a similar plan. As soon as there was enough light to see by, he packed his bug-out bag, strapped a hunting knife to his belt, and gripped his baseball bat. He took one last look around his apartment, knowing he'd probably never see it again, then pushed the couch aside and cautiously opened his door. The hallway was empty but trashed, doors hung open, belongings were scattered everywhere, and there was blood smeared on the walls. He moved quietly to the stairwell, listening carefully before entering. The stairs seemed clear. He descended slowly, checking each landing, every nerve on high alert. On the second floor, he heard movement in one of the apartments, a shuffling, dragging sound accompanied by that awful moaning. He moved past as quickly and quietly as possible. The lobby of his building was a nightmare scene. The glass doors were shattered. The security desk was overturned. And there were 3 of the infected wandering around, bumping into walls and furniture. One of them had been his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, a sweet old lady who used to bake him cookies. Now she was a monster, her floral dress covered in gore, her dentures clicking as her jaw worked mindlessly. Marcus felt a wave of grief and rage, but he pushed it down. Emotion would get him killed. He studied the infected, noting how they moved, how they reacted to stimuli. When he knocked quietly on the wall to his left, all 3 of them immediately turned toward the sound and started shuffling in that direction. They were attracted to noise. Good to know. While they were distracted, Marcus sprinted for the broken doors, glass crunching under his boots. He was through and out onto the street before they could react. The morning air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning plastic. All around him was devastation. Detroit had never been the safest or prettiest city, but this was something else entirely. Cars were crashed and burning. Bodies lay in the streets. Buildings had been broken into and looted. And everywhere were the infected, some wandering alone, others in small groups. Marcus oriented himself and started moving north, staying close to buildings, using cars and debris for cover. His truck was parked 6 blocks away at the fire station. If he could reach it and if it was still functional, he had a chance. Jennifer spent the morning reinforcing Jake's property and taking inventory of their supplies. They had more than she'd expected. Jake really had been preparing for something like this. Cases of canned food, bags of rice and beans, water filtration systems, medical supplies, ammunition for the various firearms Jake owned. "How long can we hold out here?" she asked her brother. Jake scratched his beard, calculating. "With 6 of us? If we're careful and supplement with the garden and chickens, maybe 6 months. Longer if we can hunt and gather safely. 6 months." The number hung in the air. What would the world look like in 6 months? Would there even be a functioning society left? Connor, Jake's 17-year-old son, came running from the barn. "Dad, we've got movement on the access road. Looks like people." Everyone grabbed weapons, guns, mainly, though Jennifer felt her stomach turn at the thought of possibly having to shoot another human being. They took up defensive positions, watching as a group of about 8 people trudged up the long driveway. They were clearly exhausted, carrying what belongings they'd managed to grab. As they got closer, Jennifer could see they were just scared families from town, not infected. Jake stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand but pointed down. "That's far enough," he called. "Y'all been bitten? Anyone sick?" The refugees stopped, and a middle-aged man in the front raised his hands. "No sir, we're clean. The town is gone. Those things are everywhere. We heard you had a farm out here, thought maybe." He trailed off, looking hopeless. Jennifer felt her heart break. These were her neighbors, people she'd known for years. But Jake's expression remained hard. "I'm sorry, truly, but we don't have supplies for more people. Best thing you can do is keep heading north, find somewhere remote to hole up." The refugees started pleading, and Jennifer wanted to invite them in, wanted to help, but she looked at Emma and knew Jake was right. They couldn't save everyone. If they tried, they'd all starve. The refugees eventually moved on, casting bitter looks back at the farm. Rachel was crying. That was the Hendersons. "I've known Beth Henderson since high school." Jake put his arm around his wife. "I know. But we make that call 10 more times, and we're overrun, and we all die. I hate it too, but this is the world now." Jennifer understood the logic, but it didn't make it any easier. This was what survival looked like, hard choices and living with the guilt. She forced herself to think about Emma, to remember that her first duty was to her daughter. That was the only way she'd get through this. Tyler's group made their move around noon. They descended the emergency stairs in tight formation, Tyler in front with a makeshift spear, a mop handle with a knife duct taped to the end. They made it down 4 floors before encountering their first infected, a businessman who looked like he'd jumped or fallen into the stairwell from a higher floor. Both his legs were bent at wrong angles, but he still dragged himself toward them with horrifying determination, moaning and reaching with bloody hands. Tyler hesitated for just a second. This had been a person, someone's husband or father or friend, but then he thrust the spear forward, catching the infected in the eye. The thing dropped, finally still. Tyler's hands were shaking. Behind him, someone was throwing up. He'd just killed a man, or what used to be a man. There was no time to process it. "Keep moving," he said, his voice hoarse. They encountered more infected as they descended, small groups that they had to fight through. It was ugly, brutal work. The infected didn't feel pain, so you had to completely destroy the brain or sever the spinal cord to stop them. Tyler and James did most of the fighting, protecting the others, but everyone got blood on them. They lost one person, a quiet guy from accounting named Peter, when he slipped on the stairs and an infected fell on him, biting into his throat before anyone could react. They had to leave him there, screaming and dying, because there was no time and nothing they could do. The screams followed them down 3 more floors before finally cutting off. Moments later, they heard the awful sound of Peter rising again, now one of the infected. The parking garage was less crowded with infected than Tyler had feared, just a handful wandering between the cars. They fought through, losing another person, a woman named Dorothy who was older and couldn't run fast enough when 3 infected converged on her. Her sacrifice bought the others time to reach Tyler's truck. Tyler fumbled with his keys, hands slick with blood and sweat, and finally got the door open. They piled in, 10 people crammed into a vehicle meant for 5. Tyler turned the key, and the engine started, the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. He threw it in reverse and punched the gas, running over an infected person who had lunged at the truck. The bump of the body under the tires made everyone gasp, but Tyler kept going, weaving through the garage and up the ramp toward the exit. The street outside was an obstacle course of abandoned vehicles and wandering infected. Tyler drove up onto the sidewalk, sideswiping parked cars, doing whatever it took to keep moving. Infected threw themselves at the truck, hands slapping against the windows, teeth gnashing. The windshield cracked when one of them landed on the hood, its face pressed against the glass, milky eyes staring at nothing. Tyler swerved hard, and it rolled off. Behind them, the infected gave chase for a while but eventually fell behind. The truck wasn't fast, too much weight, too many obstacles, but it was faster than the shambling infected. Tyler kept driving north, out of downtown, through neighborhoods that had been war zones just hours before and were now eerily quiet except for the occasional gunshot or scream. Marcus made it to his fire station with only one serious encounter. A group of 5 infected had cornered him in an alley, and he'd had to fight his way out with his bat. It was the first time he'd really seen what they were capable of. They didn't coordinate or strategize, but they were relentless. One of them took 3 solid hits to the head before going down. Another grabbed his jacket and wouldn't let go even after he'd bashed its arms so badly the bones were showing through. He'd escaped with some scratches and bruises but no bites, which was all that mattered. The fire station had been breached, the bay doors were open, and infected wandered through the building he'd called his second home. But his truck was still there, a big pickup he used for hunting trips. He circled around to the back entrance, climbed in through a window, and made his way to the garage. The keys were in the locker room, which meant going through the main area of the station. Marcus took a deep breath and moved quickly, bat at the ready. An infected firefighter, Tommy, who'd been his partner for 6 years, came at him from the kitchen. Marcus didn't hesitate this time. He swung the bat with all his strength, connecting with Tommy's temple with a sickening crack. Tommy dropped, and Marcus kept moving, blinking away tears. No time to mourn. Not yet. He grabbed his keys, along with extra supplies from the station, rope, tools, a med kit, water bottles, anything he could carry. Then he was in his truck, starting the engine, and crashing through the already damaged bay door into the street. He had a destination in mind, a cabin his family owned up in the Upper Peninsula, near a little town called Copper Harbor. It was remote, isolated, on a lake with good fishing. If he could make it there, he'd have a chance. It was a long drive though, maybe 8 hours in normal conditions. Today, who knew how long it would take? He pointed the truck north and started driving, navigating around the wreckage of civilization. Other survivors were on the move too, some in vehicles, others on foot. Marcus saw terrible things, people being pulled from cars and attacked, groups fighting over supplies, bodies everywhere. He wanted to help, but he was one man with limited resources. The best he could do was save himself and hope others were doing the same. By early afternoon, Tyler had gotten his group out of the worst of the city and into the suburbs. The infected were less concentrated here, but they were still everywhere. The truck was running on fumes, the gas gauge was almost on empty. They needed to find fuel and more supplies. Tyler pulled into a strip mall that looked relatively intact. "Okay, here's how this works," he told the group. "4 of us going, me, James, Sheila, and Ashley. The rest of you stay in the truck, keep it running, and if things go bad, you drive away. Don't wait for us." Preston started to argue, but Tyler cut him off. "This isn't a debate. We need supplies, and we need people who can move fast. That's the team." The 4 of them approached the strip mall cautiously. There was a grocery store, a pharmacy, and a gas station, exactly what they needed. The grocery store's windows were smashed, and they could see movement inside. "Infected. Too many," James muttered. Tyler agreed. They moved to the pharmacy instead. The door was locked but the glass was reinforced, which meant probably no one had broken in yet. Tyler used a tire iron to smash through, and they slipped inside. The pharmacy was dark and quiet. They spread out, grabbing anything useful, medications, first aid supplies, water bottles, energy bars. Ashley found a camping section and started loading backpacks with supplies. Sheila was grabbing all the antibiotics and pain meds she could find. Then they heard it, moaning from the back of the store. At least 3 or 4 infected, drawn by the sound of breaking glass. "Time to go," Tyler said. They rushed for the exit, arms full of supplies, but the infected were between them and the door. Tyler dropped his supplies and raised his spear. James grabbed a metal shelf and used it as a battering ram. They fought through, brutal and desperate. Ashley took a bad scratch down her arm from an infected's grasping hand but managed to pull away before it could get a grip. They burst out of the pharmacy and ran for the truck, infected stumbling after them. The group in the truck had the doors open, and they piled in, throwing their supplies ahead of them. Tyler jumped in the driver's seat and floored it, clipping one of the infected and sending it spinning. A few blocks away, they found an abandoned car with the gas cap open and a siphon hose lying next to it. Someone else had been thinking the same thing. Tyler used the hose to siphon gas from several vehicles, filling his tank. It was a nerve-wracking process, with infected wandering nearby, but they managed it. While Tyler worked, Sheila examined Ashley's scratch. "I don't think it's deep enough to be a bite," she said, cleaning and bandaging it. But everyone kept glancing at Ashley nervously, thinking the same thing. What if a scratch was enough? What if she turned? Ashley noticed the looks and said quietly, "If I start to change, you put me down fast. Don't let me become one of those things." The truck went silent. Sheila just nodded and squeezed Ashley's hand. Marcus was making better time than he'd expected. Once he'd gotten out of Detroit proper, the roads were clearer. There were infected in every town he passed through, but fewer of them, and they were easier to avoid. He'd stopped once for gas at an abandoned station, using a trick his grandfather had taught him to manually pump fuel. He'd also raided a sporting goods store for supplies, grabbing a hunting rifle, ammunition, camping gear, and freeze-dried food. No one had challenged him. The few other survivors he'd seen had been too busy with their own escape to care what he was doing. The radio in his truck picked up fragmentary broadcasts, none of them good. Martial law declared. Major cities quarantined. Reports of the infection reaching Europe and Asia. This wasn't just an American crisis. This was global. Evening was falling as Marcus crossed the Mackinac Bridge, leaving the lower peninsula behind. The bridge was clogged with abandoned cars, people who'd run out of gas or broken down trying to escape north. Marcus had to weave carefully, pushing some smaller vehicles out of the way with his truck's reinforced bumper. Halfway across, he saw a group of survivors who'd taken over the bridge's maintenance building. They'd set up barricades and were holed up, probably planning to stay there. One of them waved to Marcus as he passed, and he waved back. He hoped they'd make it, but an isolated bridge with no supplies wasn't a long-term solution. Still, people were adapting, finding ways to survive. That gave him hope. Back at Jake's farm, night was falling again, and the family was settling into a routine. They'd set up a watch schedule, with 2 people on guard at all times. They'd reinforced the windows and doors even more, and Jake had showed them all how to use the guns, even the kids. Jennifer hated putting a rifle in Emma's hands, but Jake was right, everyone needed to know how to defend themselves. Emma had taken to it surprisingly well, her fear transforming into a grim determination. "I won't let those things get us, Mom," she'd said, and Jennifer had never been more proud and heartbroken at the same time. Her little girl was growing up way too fast, in a world no child should have to endure. They'd spent the afternoon slaughtering some of the chickens and preserving the meat. It was grim work, but necessary. They couldn't rely on the chickens surviving the winter or potential raids by infected or desperate humans. They needed to maximize their food supply now. Rachel had set up a canning operation in the kitchen, turning fresh vegetables from the garden into preserved goods. Connor and Lily had worked on improving the barricades and setting up early warning systems, tin cans on strings, that sort of thing. Low-tech but effective. Jake had started digging a latrine away from the house, planning for the day when the plumbing stopped working entirely. Every task was a reminder that the old world was gone and they were building something new from its ashes. Tyler's group had found temporary refuge in a church on the outskirts of a small town called Northville. The church was sturdy, built of stone, with heavy wooden doors that could be barricaded. A group of townspeople had already taken shelter there, led by the pastor, a woman named Reverend Martha Collins. She'd welcomed Tyler's group warily, but the church had room and supplies, so she'd let them stay. There were about 30 people total now, ranging from infants to elderly. The mood was somber but not defeated. People were adapting, organizing, doing what needed to be done. Reverend Collins had set up a watch system, rationing supplies, and even started holding regular services, giving people something to hold on to. Tyler helped reinforce the church's defenses, using his military experience to set up proper barricades and sight lines. The infected wandered through the town but hadn't organized an assault on the church yet. Still, everyone knew it was only a matter of time. "We can't stay here forever," Tyler told Reverend Collins. "We need to think about the future, about finding somewhere more defensible long-term." The Reverend nodded thoughtfully. "There's a state park about 20 miles north, lots of land, cabins, a lake. If we could get everyone there safely, we could build something more permanent." Tyler considered it. Moving 30 people, including kids and elderly, through infected territory was risky. But staying put and hoping the infected lost interest was probably riskier. "Let's scout it out tomorrow," he said. "See if it's viable." That night, Ashley developed a fever. Everyone's worst fear had come true, she was turning. The scratch must have been enough to transmit the infection. Ashley knew what was happening before anyone else. She pulled Tyler and Sheila aside and said calmly, "It's starting. I can feel it. I'm not going to hurt anyone." She was isolated in a small room off the sanctuary, and people took turns sitting with her as she declined. It was brutal to watch. The fever climbed. She became confused, agitated. Her eyes started to cloud over. Through it all, she fought to stay herself as long as possible, giving them information. "Hurts," she gasped. "Burns. Can't think straight. Hungry, so hungry." Then, finally, she looked at Tyler with the last of her awareness and whispered, "Now. Do it now." Tyler had seen combat, had done difficult things, but this was the hardest thing he'd ever had to do. He raised his weapon, a tire iron, and brought it down. Ashley stopped moving. Sheila was crying. Tyler felt numb. They wrapped Ashley's body and buried her in the church cemetery as Reverend Collins said a prayer. Everyone from the group attended, a moment of shared grief in a world that had stopped making sense. "She was brave," James said. "Right to the end." Tyler nodded. "They'd all have to be brave now. There was no other choice." Marcus reached his cabin around 10 p.m., exhausted but relieved. The cabin was exactly as he remembered, a simple structure on a lake, surrounded by woods, miles from the nearest town. He'd passed through Copper Harbor on the way, and it had been virtually deserted. A few locals had barricaded themselves in buildings, but they'd left him alone, and he'd returned the courtesy. The remote location meant the infection hadn't hit as hard here yet. It would come eventually. The infected seemed to wander randomly, spreading like a slow plague, but for now, it was quiet. Marcus unloaded his supplies, secured the cabin, and finally let himself collapse on the couch. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt something like safe. But sleep wouldn't come easily. His mind kept replaying the last 2 days, kept seeing Tommy's infected face, kept hearing the screams from the city. He'd survived, but so many hadn't. His ex-wife had been visiting her sister in Chicago, he had no idea if she'd made it. His parents were retired in Florida, another major population center. His friends, his co-workers, all scattered across a country that had torn itself apart in a matter of hours. The odds of any of them surviving were slim. Marcus had never felt so alone. He got up and walked to the cabin's small dock, looking out over the dark water. The stars were brilliant out here, away from the city lights. The world was ending, but the universe didn't care. It kept on spinning, indifferent to human suffering. Over the next few days, patterns emerged. The infected were strong and relentless but not intelligent. They responded to noise and movement but could be evaded with care. They didn't seem to need food or water, they were driven purely by the urge to attack and infect. Bodies that had been dead for days were still mobile, though they were slower, more decayed. This meant the infected wouldn't just die off naturally. They could potentially last for months, maybe longer, until decomposition finally destroyed them completely. For the survivors, this was crushing news. There would be no quick end to this nightmare. It was going to be a long struggle. Communication networks were almost entirely down. No internet, No cell service, no television. A few ham radio operators were still broadcasting, sharing information and trying to coordinate survivors, but the news was uniformly grim. The government had collapsed. Military units had either been overrun or had broken apart as soldiers abandoned their posts to try to protect their own families. Some areas had established safe zones, but they were under constant siege. Survivor communities were forming, but they were isolated, cut off from each other. Humanity was scattered, fractured, fighting to survive in small pockets while the infected ruled the ruins of civilization. Tyler's group and the church survivors made their move to the state park on the fourth day. It was a carefully planned operation, using vehicles to carry those who couldn't walk and having strong fighters protect the flanks. They lost 2 people in the journey, an elderly man who had a heart attack from the stress, and a teenage boy who got separated from the group and was overwhelmed by infected before anyone could reach him. But the rest made it to the park, which was indeed more defensible. The cabins were spread out but could be fortified. The lake provided water and fish. The woods had game. There was even a ranger station with tools and supplies. They set about creating a real community, assigning roles, establishing rules, building something that might last. Jennifer and her family at the farm continued to weather refugees and occasional infected wandering up from town. Jake's defenses held, and they became more efficient at dealing with threats. Emma proved to have a natural talent for sharpshooting, able to take down infected from a distance with the .22 rifle Jake had given her. It disturbed Jennifer to see her daughter becoming so comfortable with violence, but it also filled her with pride. Emma was a survivor. They all were. The world had changed, and they were changing with it, becoming harder, more practical, less sentimental. It was adapt or die. Marcus spent his time securing his position and planning for the long term. He reinforced the cabin, set up rainwater collection systems, started fishing and hunting. He made careful trips to Copper Harbor to scavenge supplies, always moving quietly, always staying alert. He encountered other survivors occasionally, and an uneasy network began to form, people who would trade information and supplies but who remained fundamentally isolated, trusting no one completely. It was a lonely existence, but it was survival. Marcus told himself that's all that mattered. Survive today, worry about tomorrow when it comes. Weeks passed. The initial shock faded, replaced by grim determination. Survivors learned the rules of this new world: stay quiet, stay mobile, never let your guard down, trust sparingly. The infected remained a constant threat but became almost routine, something to be managed rather than feared. The real dangers became other survivors, people who'd given up on civilization and decided to take what they wanted by force. Bandits and raiders began to appear, targeting weaker groups. This forced survivors to band together for protection, forming larger communities with the strength to defend themselves. It was tribalism, a return to humanity's most basic social structure. Tyler emerged as a leader in the state park community, which they'd started calling Haven. He organized defenses, led scavenging missions, and made the hard calls when they needed to be made. Reverend Collins provided moral guidance, keeping people hopeful and united. Sheila managed supplies and rationing. James led the security teams. Everyone had a role. They took in other survivors who found their way to Haven, growing to almost 100 people. They started farming, preserving food, teaching children, even holding community gatherings and celebrations. Life, incredibly, went on. It wasn't the life they'd known, but it was life nonetheless. Jennifer's medical skills made her invaluable at the farm, which had also taken in a few other families despite Jake's initial reluctance. They'd expanded their defenses and operations, becoming a small compound. Jennifer treated injuries and illnesses with their limited supplies, delivering babies and keeping people alive when infection or injury threatened. She'd lost patience, there was only so much she could do without proper equipment or medications, but she saved more than she lost. Emma was growing up strong and capable, taking on responsibilities that would have seemed impossible just months before. The world had stolen her childhood, but it had given her purpose and strength in return. Marcus remained largely alone at his cabin, but he'd made contact with the small survivor community in Copper Harbor. They'd established a trading post system, bartering goods and services. Marcus would trade fish and game for ammunition and other supplies he couldn't make or find himself. It was a fragile economy, but it worked. He'd helped defend the town once when a large group of infected had wandered in from the south, fighting alongside people who'd been strangers but were now something like allies. Connection, even tentative and limited, was better than complete isolation. Humans were social creatures, even in the apocalypse. The darkness that had spread across the cities, across the country, across the world, had changed everything. Millions had died in the initial outbreak. Millions more had joined the ranks of the infected. Civilization as it had existed was gone, likely forever. But humanity survived. In isolated pockets, in small communities, in fortified strongholds, people endured. They adapted, learned, grew stronger. The fight was far from over, the infected still outnumbered the living, and winter was coming, bringing new challenges, but the survivors had something the infected didn't. They had hope, ingenuity, courage. They had each other. Marcus stood on his dock one evening as autumn painted the trees in brilliant colors. He thought about everything he'd lost, everything that had been taken from him and from the world. But he also thought about what remained. He was alive. Others were alive. Maybe, somehow, that would be enough. Maybe they could rebuild, not what was, but something new. Something that learned from the mistakes of the old world. It was a fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. He watched the sun set over the lake, painting the sky in reds and golds, and allowed himself to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. That was all anyone could do now, survive, adapt, and hope that the darkness wouldn't last forever. The cities had fallen, but the human spirit endured. And as long as it did, there was a chance. A chance for survival, for recovery, for a future that no one could yet imagine but that might, just might, be worth fighting for.